would say this: if you have been ambushed by tongue tie the moment your baby is born, I hope you see this video. It can be so traumatic. My son was born with a really intense tongue tie that went to the very front of his tongue. They could hardly fit a pinky in his mouth when he was born, barely. Like, he was just completely restricted, and a lot of professionals that he saw said it was the most intense tie they'd ever seen. He was first born, the pediatrician just called it out like, oh, he's got a tongue tie. I'd heard of this before and my heart sunk. I had no idea the journey that I would be on to try and get him to latch. And I didn't really understand the whole breastfeeding journey. He was my first, so I didn't even understand any of the obstacles that involved breastfeeding beyond having a tongue tie. You hit the ground running almost, where I had to start pumping right away, every 2 hours, around the clock, exclusively pumping mamas can relate. But it is insane when you go from being pregnant, kind of living your life, to being tethered every 2 hours to the wall. The most life-saving thing is to have portable pumps, and that like changed my life, being able to have that. You on this whole journey of what we did to get him to finally latch. I want to say that a lot of people were really supportive and saying you don't need to breastfeed, like to kind of taking that pressure off. But what I want to say is that if you want to breastfeed, you can. And I know that there are different elements that really can affect that, work and time constraints around trying to implement latching, and also like insurance and access to lactation consultants. I did 2 really amazing lactation consultants. I actually went through one lactation consultant to begin with, who was awesome to get us started off pumping, but we really needed a hands-on technical approach, because I would just like have him there and he wouldn't even, like, he didn't even understand what the boob was. He like didn't understand what a real nipple was. He was completely dependent upon the bottle, and I really felt that that was never going to change. And it really was a miracle when it did, and I actually couldn't believe it, which is why I wanted to share it. But there are really technical elements, there's really emotional elements, there's really like personal elements, and there's like so many individual pieces to it. But I felt that I was such an outsider of any case, because they said it was such an intense tongue tie. He was snipped in the hospital. He used a clip, which you should not do. Learn from my mistake. Do not get them clipped in the hospital. You want to use a laser. You want to go to a dentist if you can that specializes in that, and child dentistry, so that way they understand kind of more of the full picture. The biggest key is being able to exercise that wound once it happens with the tie, and I will show you guys a picture of his before and after. You know, you think like a tongue tie, it's like, okay, this is all oral. It's not. The body work piece of it was really crucial. Again, like, it affects the whole, it's not just oral, it affects the whole body. Once we had the release in the hospital, I was like, okay, he's ready to like start going to chiropractic. And we took him to chiropractic. We took him to CST, which is craniosacral therapy, that really helps with moving around like some of the fluid, the spinal fluid, and kind of creating that equilibrium so that way they can latch. And there's stories of women that go to CST and after the session they can latch. That wasn't happening with me, and it's because I didn't learn until I went to this other lactation consultant. It was kind of a last-ditch effort. I messaged her, I emailed her and said, you know, I don't even know if you can help us. And she's like, I am kind of an expert in more complex cases. And she looked at him and she was like, he's not fully released, like the tie was still kind of further back. She referred us to a speech therapist to do the oral work in order to prep him for a laser release, and that would be further back. Dentist who was going to do it was really clear that it's just a tool. It's not going to solve all the problems, and it certainly didn't. But I will say that the speech therapist, which sounds ridiculous to like take an infant to a speech therapist, but it actually was so instrumental in like getting his tongue to have mobility, and he does have a really short tongue even now. That prep was super important, and she watched like his, you know, breathing and swallowing patterns and things like that. Once we got his second release, it was horrible. Like, there was blood, like, you know, all the saliva and the blood run together, so it looked like there was so much blood. It was really traumatic. And the part, like the most traumatic part, wasn't even over yet. Like, we had to stretch him every 2 hours and I was pumping every 2 hours. We had to stretch him every 2 hours and feed every 2 hours, and it would just got to be insane trying to do that. But the stretching was so terrible because you have to put your fingers, your thumb on the chin and the index finger underneath, and you kind of, it creates like this diamond shape when you stretch it, and you really got to press down on the tongue back, straight back. And what you're doing is you're making sure that it doesn't heal up as tightly as the tie actually was. It like stretches that scar tissue, so that way he'll have more mobility in his tongue. But he also had like shoulders, his arms couldn't go above his shoulders. He had red rings around his neck because his neck was so constricted too. He was really my friend was like, he's really colicky, and it was just the tie. He was super uncomfortable. And so once we released it, he could put his arms over his head. He could, like, his neck, all the red rings went away. Like, he had so much more mobility, and he was just a different baby. And she was a really good dentist. So the first thing I would say is make sure that you get laser release and you get a really good referral from a lactation consultant who really knows what they're doing. Once he was released, like, we'd already been practicing some different latching things, but I would say that the lactation consultants I worked with were so technical, and that was so crucial. They're brilliant, amazing, nurturing. All of the lactation consultants I worked with were that, but they were a different breed because I called them like the milk fairies, or like the lactation fairies, because they're both kind of swooped in when I came in. I was just in tears, just completely. I don't think I'd ever been so heartbroken before. You really are feeling like you're at the base of a mountain, because, you know, at 3 months and he still wasn't latching, and I just knew, like, okay, a year is what you really want at least to reach for them to get all the stem cells and antibodies and things from the milk that are beneficial to them. World Health Organization recommends it, at least a year. And again, like, that is not to shame anybody that doesn't, absolutely not, but it's more of empowering women that, like, if you want to, you can. They came in and they immediately, like, got a nipple shield. They got an SNS, which is like a tube. They hooked it to my bra, my nursing bra, and it was so like exhausting, because you took this little tube and you put it through the nipple shield, and you would use the milk and you would, like, press it to, like, release some milk, so that way he knew the milk was there. Originally he wouldn't even latch onto the nipple shield. It took a lot for him to even transfer any of the milk that was, like, readily available. He just didn't understand that's where the milk came from, and he would be on his side, and he really didn't like even being on his side. As I held him, they propped 2 breastfeeding pillows underneath me, so, like, he was level, and you want to have the nipple basically above so their nose is kind of going up. They're not like this trying to latch, they're like up. Those were some of the mechanics that we worked with to make sure that he was, like, comfortable to latch, and that it was so we could just, like, take out the physiological piece a bit and work more on, like, the emotional side, or like why he wasn't latching, or the more psychological side of it. And we did that for several sessions, and it was the most emotionally exhausting, not even several sessions, I think it might have been like 10 sessions, and I would dread going, but I wanted to go. But it was just, I needed to practice twice a day at least with the SNS and the nipple shield and setting him up, and I would take whole Saturdays and just sit with him. At one point, I actually just, like, was gonna make that be how I was gonna feed him, and he would get hungry enough, he would eat. And it was a really bad day, and he was screaming, and he did end up transferring a tiny bit from the nipple shield, but it was, like, very traumatic for both of us. And I talked to one of my friends who kind of did a similar thing, and she was like, you are not going to traumatize your baby breastfeeding them. You're just not. And I think that's another thing. Like, you can feel like this is so traumatic, like, and it is, you can feel that way. But just remember also, babies are so resilient too, and adaptable, and they're, that's the same thing with the stretching. It feels like so traumatic, but know that you are doing, like, a great good for your child that outweighs that, and that they won't actually hold on to that the same way we would maybe as an adult, or as you will remember your own breastfeeding experience, because it was really traumatic for me, maybe more than him. But I would say, like, the first thing is to look into chiropractic, look into CST, and get amazing lactation consultants that are really technical and that will actually get the baby on the breast with you or make attempts and actually treat it like it's almost like a sport or just like a physical thing of making these attempts and making this kind of more routine. Eventually he did latch at 4 months and he began transferring milk. It started with the nipple shield, and I took a 2-week break of just giving him the bottle. And then I was just like, let's just try it with a nipple shield. And he, without the SNS, he just began nursing. He took a full feed. I couldn't believe it. And then eventually we went back to, we had like a mother's gathering and the lactation consultant was there. And she's like, let's just try on the breast without the nipple shield. And I was like, there's no way. I couldn't believe breastfeeding was real. I was like, this just doesn't happen. Like, you know, but he had been released for a while now. He had had his tongue tie release and he was like, you know, he was much more capable of transferring milk, and he ended up transferring there in the mom's gathering. And then I went home and he just started latching. And it was still a rocky road. Like, he was nursing and exclusively breastfed him over Thanksgiving break or Thanksgiving. And then my milk supply went down so drastically. I don't know if he wasn't transferring enough. So I began pumping again. And so we ended up only actually nursing at night. But I'm not the case for what's possible for you either. I think that absolutely I could have ended up exclusively breastfeeding him if I really, to me it was enough that he breastfed at night because the pumping sessions at night were really what were challenging, and we're still breastfeeding at night a couple times a night, which is just life-changing and was what made me able to pump through a year, because if I had to pump at night, I probably would have dropped off before a year. And another thing I was going to say, like, you think about releasing the tongue, and there is a connection between like your tongue all the way down to your toes. It's called the deep front line. And if you look it up, all the fascia like connects, and so it affects everything. So if you have like an issue with your foot, it could be your tongue. It's like your scaffolding for your palate. So like having a really high palate, which he had a really high palate, can make it really difficult for that suction to happen. And so we're probably going to have to go in and look at that as he gets older, and potentially he might need more orthodontia work and things like that for speech and but the lactation consultants were saying if you're having any trouble or pushback, like not having support from family or friends or your husband. My husband was not really on board at first. Just reminding them like this isn't just latching. This is like swallowing, breathing, speech, their ability to speak. So it does affect so much of their well-being as they get older. And breastfeeding too, like the breast tissue, it actually widens the palate, whereas a bottle is just like has one point of pressure, whereas like the breast tissue will bring the palate down because it touches more parts of the mouth. So that's like can be really critical. And I think people, you think of like the nutritional benefits of breastfeeding and the it does all the stem cells and all antibodies, and which is incredible, but also the mechanical part of the mouth, their ability to speak, their ability to swallow, their ability to breathe is affected by breastfeeding, which I did not know any of this when I first started. It was really overwhelming. I know a lot of people for mental health reasons, just you have to keep that in mind, because I think I did actually really suffer mentally, but for me it was worth it. Like my mental suffering, or not that it was worth it, but my mental suffering, I like weighed it against my desire for this, and it outweighed it, and it was something I was willing to do, was to kind of just have a bad mental state for a while, knowing that it would pass. And that's another thing I would say, is that it can feel like an unending path when you're going through this, but it does end. They don't breastfeed forever. And it's always like nice to know that you are in charge of that timeline and what you really want. But I just want moms to know that if you want to breastfeed, you can. And there are so many resources that I will link some in the description here, knowledge about like just the how much breastfeeding affects every part of your baby's development and in terms of their oral development, but also that it is possible if you really want to, and that you're not alone. You're not alone. Usually in those moments where I remember just like weeping in the car when the lactation consultant was thinking that I wanted to stop or needed permission to stop, and it was like a miscommunication. And I thought she was saying like, okay, we just need to like cut this short. And I called my husband, and I never wept like that in my life. I never had felt such heartbreak. I've never felt just like such, like you feel like you're broken, or you feel like a failure, or you feel like all those things, like, and on such a primal deep level, because to feed your baby is just like the most essential thing, and to be able to do that. And I just was not prepared for that, because I was thinking about labor and delivery, and we had some other complications, and that was on the forefront. And so being ambushed by a tongue tie, if you have other oral ties too, like he didn't have lip and cheek, but some babies do, and it can just be such a blow to your whole experience being a mom to a newborn. It really can color the whole experience. And I remember we went into the dentist to get his release, and she was like talking to us about all his appointments we had been doing and all the efforts and things like that. And she looked at us, she's like, wow, you guys really haven't had time to enjoy being parents. And we hadn't. And not just because of all the appointments and work and trying to get the tongue tie resolved, but he was so unhappy as a baby because of the tie, and he was so uncomfortable, and we didn't understand that he still needed another release after the release in the hospital. I remember looking over at my husband and being like, I feel like you don't like being a dad, or you're not having fun, like you're not enjoying this. And he was like, no, I'm not. Like, this is it's so hard and I think neither of us really understood how much it affected our baby's happiness or his ability to like thrive. And so he was just so miserable. It just created such a challenging first experience as parents. It's also one of those things where like when you're in it, it's like being adverse to trying. Like I just almost wanted to go with pumping in the bottle. But I think that given what we had been through, I feel like any baby can latch if my baby can latch, because he would like look at the boob and be like, what is that? Like he had and he still has like some oral restriction, I feel like, just in how his jaw is built and things like that. Breastfeeding also develops like the jaw too, on top of bringing the palate down. But yes, I'm going to link all those resources in the description below. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. If you are in North Carolina, the Triad area, I know the best people. He also went and saw a massage therapist, which was really good for mood and sleeping and loosening his body and just, I'll also link information about the deep front line, oral exercises and laser releases and things like that. And I know there are also dentists that don't believe in releases, that have other or more about like the oral exercises and movements and things like that. So I'll link some stuff about that down below as well. But I am just hoping that you are feeling encouraged and not alone, and I hope this story helped you a little bit if you are overwhelmed holding your newborn right now with a tongue tie and not sure quite what to do. Yeah, there's a lot of resources out there and a lot of support and networks that have a lot of information with this area specifically. So, okay, I hope this helps. I'm actually pumping right now, but I meant to say, I'm going to edit this in, that it's not just oral exercises that the speech therapist worked with. It was a lot of body work, and we started going to the chiropractor the first week he was back from the hospital. We were in the hospital for a week because of jaundice, and we got out and immediately went to the chiropractor, and he had already had his release in the hospital, but because unbeknownst to us, the release wasn't like fully done. That chiropractic work, which is like trying to kind of align the spine or like release the spine, it's almost like a rubber band when you snap it, and the effect of it goes back to like from the bottom of the spine to the top. It wasn't like getting that full effect because he was still tied. So he actually went to the chiropractor 2 times a week for a while, for 3 months before we even realized that he was, before I contacted that lactation consultant and as a last ditch effort to help, and she realized that he was still tied. And so the chiropractic work and the body work, and that was one of the things that the dentist asked, is what kind of body work were we doing. So we were already doing CST with Erin Balkan. She does the Bowen method. We were already doing CST, and we were already going to the chiropractor consistently. And unfortunately, I'm not sure how much the chiropractic helped because he hadn't been fully released yet. I'm sure it really did help. When you have contractions, your baby gets 30 pounds of pressure on it. So it's a good idea to go to a chiropractor after giving birth, no matter what, just because contractions put so much pressure on your baby's little spine. But also for like in my case, being an induction, the Pitocin puts 100 pounds of pressure on your baby. So he really needed chiropractic in general. Like when he came out, he had also asymmetry from being stuck under my tailbone, and he just had that might have affected the latching too, I'm not sure. But chiropractic is just such a beneficial thing to do when they're that young, and just to get everything kind of realigned. And Village Family Chiropractic was amazing. I love them so much. I love their family run, most wonderful doctors ever. If you are near Kernersville, North Carolina, Triad area, Village Family Chiropractic, they just changed our life. Absolutely. And if you can go as a family, it's even better. There's so much, I will link that as well. There's so many benefits to chiropractic work that I had no idea about. And that's the thing, is that there are so many benefits that came out of this, just with general well-being and things that you can do for your child as they're growing so much in their first year, that even if they aren't having latching issues, could be really helpful for them, for their nervous system. And I really think that the CST really changed his nervous system, because he is a pretty calm baby. But yeah, I just wanted to mention that body work it's body work and oral work. And so yeah, the dentist wanted to know what kind of body work he had done, and then even the speech therapist, it was oral work, but it was also body work, and a lot of, like, they're called guppies, where they stretch out their neck, move them side to side, get them to connect their right and their left side. The massage therapist he saw did right to left, left to right, with his arms to kind of make that crossover. So there's a lot of like neuromuscular work that was done that's just beneficial for any baby in general, but especially if you're having issues with flexion. And CST also helps with torticollis and things like that. He didn't have torticollis, but he did have some asymmetry that corrected with chiropractic. So I just wanted to mention that about, I thought that was really important to mention the body work piece of it was really crucial. Again, like, it affects the whole, it's not just oral, it affects the whole body. It affects the deep front line from your tongue all the way down to your toes. And that's why when that release, that fascia gets that kind of reprieve, or gets that, like, that looseness, you can kind of see it all through the body. And it's really interesting to know this too as an adult. If you do have a tie, or you have other restrictions or things like that as an adult, there's things you can do, there's exercises, there's treatment too. So